Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for this third session of this year's Crucial Conversation series on confronting anti-Semitism. I'd like to start the evening by thanking our generous sponsors for this series, Nancy and Ray L. Hunt, in memory of Barbara Rabin, Texas Instruments, Nissan Foundation, City of Dallas Office of Arts and Culture, and IMA Financial Group and IMA Foundation. We are so grateful for your support of the mission in this important series. Thank you. I'd also like to extend our thanks to our community partners for tonight's event. It's a long list, so bear with me. The Anti-Defamation League, Congregation Shereth Israel, Faith Forward Dallas, Jewish Family Services of Greater Dallas, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas's Jewish Community Relations Council, Legacy Senior Communities, Resource Center, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Emmanuel, Temple Shalom, and the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Thank you all so much for your support and partnership. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to our museum members and board members with us this evening. Your support is crucial to our mission, and I appreciate all you do. In our second year of the Crucial Conversation series, we are confronting anti-Semitism, a hatred that has existed for millennia. Through this series of programs, we aim to foster an increased understanding of the origins and history of anti-Semitism, to discuss the recent increase in anti-Semitism globally and in the United States, and to identify concrete steps that can be taken to confront and disrupt anti-Semitism. At the museum, we teach about the historical consequences of hatred, but anti-Semitism did not end with the Holocaust. Around the world, not only is anti-Semitism still present, but it is increasing virulently. Tonight, we will discuss global anti-Semitism and its growing presence. We will conclude the series on August 5th with a session on strategies to combat anti-Semitism. Tonight, we will leave time for questions at the end of the discussion, so please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions. I ask that you try to focus your questions on the topics we are covering tonight, and save the questions about how we confront anti-Semitism for our final session. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Because we have so much to talk about tonight, the program may run a little longer than usual, but we are recording tonight's session, so you can always come back to it if you need to step away at any point. Just go to the DHHRM YouTube channel to access the recording. I'm now pleased to have such an esteemed panel with us tonight and to introduce them. I want to leave as much time as possible, so I will just introduce them briefly. Dr. Gunter Yakeli is a historian and sociologist with a particular interest in the study of anti-Semitism. He holds the Erna B. Rosenfeld Professorship at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, Bourne's Jewish Studies program at Indiana University, and is an associate professor of Germanic Studies and Jewish Studies. In 2013, he received the Raoul Wallenberg Prize in Human Rights and Holocaust Studies. Dr. Sharon Nazarian is a senior vice president of international affairs for the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. She heads ADL's work fighting anti-Semitism and racial hatred globally, including overseeing ADL's Israel office. She's the president of the Y&S Nazarian Family Foundation and the founder of the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and chair of its advisory board. Robert Williams is Deputy Director for International Affairs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, sits on the steering committee of the Global Task Force on Holocaust Distortion, and served for 4 years as chair of the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Outside of his work, he is co-editing a volume for Routledge on the history of anti-Semitism and a separate monograph on the impact and forms of contemporary political anti-Semitism. And our moderator tonight, our own Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, is the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer for the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. An experienced educator, she has researched, taught, and written on Jewish culture and history. She regularly speaks on the Holocaust, topics in Jewish history and culture, and the history covered in the museum's core and special exhibitions. I'd now like to turn the program over to Sarah and our expert panel. Sarah?
Thank you, Mary Pat. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you to our distinguished panelists. I'm looking forward to the conversation with you tonight. So global anti-Semitism, as we discussed when we talked earlier, is a vast topic. And so what we're going to try and do is break it down into some manageable blocks of information. So let's start by focusing on the current state of global anti-Semitism. But before we do that, let's look back over the past 50 years or so and talk about what trends we've seen in anti-Semitism globally during this period. And again, I realize that this is vast, so please, each of you feel free to focus on the area with which you are most knowledgeable. And for most of these, I won't direct you one to the other, but for this first one, just to kind of ease us in, I'll ask Robert to speak first, and then Sharon, and then Gunter, and then for the next, it'll flow more naturally. So Robert, what is your view on this?
Thanks, Sarah. Actually, before beginning, I just want to say it's always nice to be in Texas, even if only virtually. So a big thanks to you and your colleagues at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Center and Museum. Over the course of the last 50 years, let's be honest, things for a while looked like they were improving. So in the 1960s and early 1970s, you had negotiations between Western countries and the Soviet Union to bring Soviet Jews out of state-run policy that was anti-Semitic. In the 70s and 80s, we had more and more discussion about the realities of the Holocaust, drawing attention not only to that historical event, but to the need to address anti-Semitism in our midst. And in the 1990s, after communism fell, one country after another in Europe began passing all manner of measures to protect Jewish communities, to ensure education and remembrance on the Holocaust and related efforts. But anti-Semitism was always there, and it really struck home in frightening ways just a few years ago. In France in 2015, the year began with the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the Hyper Caché supermarkets, events that were in many ways just a legacy of the anti-Semitic violence of 2014. And it's even the events of November 2015, the Bataclan attacks of the year of later in that year, were terror attacks carried out in part because that club had Jewish owners. So things really came home to roost. And what we're seeing today, and I can go into some detail, but I want to let my colleagues speak. What we're seeing today is a very sad day-to-day reality in Europe. 89% of Jews in the EU know that anti-Semitism's increased in their countries. 20% have family members or friends who have been the victims of verbal or physical assaults. And perhaps most disturbing of all, about 80%, technically 79.2%, don't even go to the police to report these crimes, more often than not because they feel it's pointless to do so.
Okay. Sharon?
I think just building up on what Robert said, I just want to zoom out for a moment and talk about some global trends that we saw really pick up at the end of last century and the beginning of this century. And I would start by talking about anxieties that lead to anti-Semitism. So let's talk about the real proliferation of ultranationalism, populism in political movements, whether it's in Europe or in Latin America. We have a little touch of it here in the US. So that was definitely a global trend that we saw really manifest in Asia and Africa, really everywhere. Secondarily, I would talk about anxiety that came from mass movement of people, whether it was, war-torn civilians leaving the Middle East into Europe, whether it was economic refugees coming from Latin America to Northern America, these kinds of mass movements lead to not only anxieties, but xenophobia, and anti-Semitism always obviously follows in all that. And then finally, I would say the role of technology. What has happened in the last 50 years, and probably we're feeling it more acutely right now, is first of all, on the positive side, we saw the positive aspects of technology and social media and the connections that's brought for us. But on the negative side, not only about the social media companies have acting as a megaphone of mainstreaming ideologies that have always been there, right? Those kind of hate language, those kinds of ideologies of extremist viewpoints, whether it's on the right or the left, has always been there. They were always on the fringes, though. We didn't have access to them in the way that we do today. So the social media and technological changes in our society have now made those ideologies readily available, made them mainstream, and actually serve as a tool to spread those hateful ideologies. So for me, the coming together of these three variables in the same time, really what set us apart from the post-World War II shame that came with the Holocaust for most of Europe. And, we see that the triple threat of what happened in Europe, and we're feeling it today. So I'll leave it to Gunther to talk a little bit more about Europe specifically, but I would say globally, these were trends that were really felt around the world.
Okay. Gunther.
Yes, thank you. Well, first, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel, and thanks to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum to organize this. I think it's a really important topic. Unfortunately, now all over the world, or in many parts of the world. I was an historian by training, and I didn't think that I have to deal more and more with really contemporary topics. But you were right to ask these questions about the trends of 50 years. So I thought about it, and I think I see politically three large trends here. So anti-Semitism in the modern form is often a threat to democracy in various forms. And so there are a number of movements that attack democracy from different corners. And anti-Semitism is often at the core of it. So we see in the 1960s, end of the 1960s, we see that the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda is getting more and more traction also in the Western world, and increasingly so. When it was first in smaller intellectual circles in Europe at the end of the 1960s, where this strong anti-Zionist ideology, whether it comes from Zionism as racism, and then attacking Jews on the streets in Europe with this kind of ideology from the radical left, that was going more and more into mainstream. We don't see these terrorist attacks from the radical left today as we've seen them 40 years ago, 30 years ago even. But these kind of ideas have gone more into mainstream. We see what was pointed out already by Sharon, these populist political parties. They have gone from, they have learned that these kind of neo-Nazi, very confrontational strategy does not work well with, luckily, with larger parts of the population. But what works well is to glorify the national past. And in Europe, if you want to glorify the national past, in almost all of the countries, you have to diminish, ignore, belittle the Holocaust, the role of the nation in the Holocaust. So that comes with Holocaust denial, Holocaust diminishing, attacks on the Jewish communities, or ostracizing the Jewish communities even further. And then what we have also, a big trend, is also from 1979 to be precise, and even earlier, with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that we got a strong push for Islamist movements that were there before, but we got this very strong push for Islamist movements around the world, and increasingly also in Europe. In Europe, they're responsible for the most murderous attacks on Jews, Islamist ideology. almost all of the murders, anti-Semitic murders in the past 20 years were to some extent with some Islamist ideology, more or less organized, often not well organized. But when we can see, when we look at the rationales of the perpetrators, we can see this. So these trends that were there before, but they have increased, they have gone more into some mainstream forms. So we see this now playing out, and Jewish communities it's different in every European country a little bit, but often these are strong factors, or where anti-Semitism is coming from, but also in the mainstream society. We should not forget that there is also often a strong negative view of Jews to some extent, where Jews are made responsible for anything, the coronavirus or the Middle East conflict, and so that is an easy target, and we see that increasingly.
Your comment just now put me in mind of and the ADL actually published this, Sharon, early in the coronavirus pandemic. There was a political cartoon that came out of a Middle Eastern information station, and it was a blue coronavirus bug, but instead of having crowns on it, it had Jewish stars. So it very neatly kind of encapsulated the Middle East Arab-Israeli conflict and the coronavirus. So old anti-Semitism, new anti-Semitism in a really neat package. Okay, Gunther, you just touched upon it a little bit, but what I'd like to ask the three of you now to do is for each of you to focus on the region of the world that's your area of specialization, or the two regions of the world that are your area of specialization, and talk a little bit about where anti-Semitism comes from. So where it comes from in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and then in Europe. So let's start with Africa, I guess. I'm assuming, Sharon, is that your area, or is it Asia?
No, my role at ADL is really truly global.
Okay.
The way we're set up at ADL, as a largely American organization, we cover my team, the international affairs team, covers the rest of the world as well. And we have subject area specialists in Latin America, Middle East, Europe, a little bit of Asia, and a little bit of Africa. I'll start by talking, I'm happy to talk a little bit about Europe, but also about the Middle East and about Latin America as well. My team's focus today, if you were ask me what region of the world is of biggest concern, I think we would all agree it's Europe. It has the largest Jewish community outside the US and Israel. And it's really where that triple threat that I mentioned, the threats from the right, the far right, threats from the far left, and then radical Islam. And I think when we look at Europe, we see symptoms of problems and challenges and rise in anti-Semitism in ways that we can also see around the rest of the world. So when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to Holocaust denial, when it comes to the conflation of extremism from the left and the right coming together, when we see in Europe legislation banning ritual circumcision or ban of kosher slaughter. This is when the extreme right and the extreme left come together, join hands, and usually I would say in Europe, and Gunther again can speak to this, but the goal really is not even targeting the Jewish communities, but more the Muslim communities. But we do see that obviously the whole notion of Jewish life in Europe becomes questioned, right? Can you live as a vibrant Jewish community in Europe? So Europe really for us at ADL represents the biggest challenges of Jewish community life and anti-Semitism. Moving to Latin America, I would say that Latin America has a very different focus with two very large communities in Brazil and in Argentina. The challenges facing the Jewish communities in those countries are largely the same as the other citizens. You have classic anti-Semitism that are Christian anti-Semitism that have been there forever. You have countries like Chile, where the large Palestinian Chilean community, it's almost 500,000 strong, have imported the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to Chile. So you have the kind of the more Middle Eastern leftist kind of anti-Semitism in a country like Chile. So you see that different parts of Latin America will reflect more their own political environments, their own economic anxieties I mentioned, the same conspiracy theories, some classic, Jews control the financial systems, Jews control, whether it's the US and the US ability to support them financially or not. So very much a reflection of that. And with COVID, when we checked in with all the communities, literally all of them in Latin America, across Europe, in the Middle East, we saw that a lot of the challenges the communities were worried about had to do with the same anxieties that the broader society had, and yet they knew it would manifest somehow in anti-Semitism. And a lot of it had to do around economic anxieties. I would say that in Africa and Asia, I'll point out South Africa has been a really extreme challenge as a country that has its own historic legacy of apartheid. Today, especially given the latest round of conflict between Israel and Hamas, but this is true even before that, the Jewish community feels more responsible and held responsible for Israeli policies on a day-to-day basis. It is really the import of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict on a day-to-day in their lives. And the fact that the South African society has kind of embraced Palestinian rights and Palestinian statehood and fighting against the so-called apartheid, that their own legacy was now showing that onto the Palestinian self-determination and really embracing kind of the anti-Zionist and anti-Israel rhetoric in South Africa. So the Jewish community feels very much beleaguered by that. And not only can they not show in any way any possible support for Israel as a state, but they're literally held responsible for policies of the Israeli government in a way that we deem at ADL purely anti-Semitic. So we say that, wherever you are, whether in Europe or Latin America or Africa, if you want to go and demonstrate for Palestinian rights and against Israeli policies in front of the Israeli embassy, totally legitimate. You want to go into your town square and hold demonstrations, totally legitimate. But if you go in front of a Jewish-owned business with Hamas flags, that is considered anti-Semitic as far as we're concerned in the ADL. If you go in front of a synagogue, if you go in front of a Jewish community center, that kind of activism, which really has been felt this round more than any time before, as a result of the latest conflict between Israel and Hamas, that is where the Jews around the world are feeling that they are being not only held responsible, but also vilified and felt to feel like the other. So again, classic anti-Semitic sentiment that Jews have felt throughout centuries.
If I could just build upon that for a moment, I'll return to Europe, but I think it's important to note perhaps the distinction that makes Europe a special case. In Africa and in Asia too, but I'll keep with Africa as the example. There's no particular shared anti-Semitic ethos that's at play. Sharon captured quite nicely, actually, the particular dynamics of South Africa's relationship to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something that is not healthy, to say the least. But at the same time, in South Africa, you have 3 vibrant Holocaust museums and some growing interest in that as a historical subject at the very least. You also have other regions of Africa. Yemen's a good case. In March of this year, Yemen's very small Jewish community became even smaller. The 13 families that were there, 13 families moved out and only 6 people remain. That's in part because of the Yemeni regime's relationship to Iran. But at the same time, you have countries like Rwanda, where there's great public interest in issues like anti-Semitism and in maintaining public awareness about the dangers of what happens when hatred goes unchecked. So it's a very complicated situation. For good or ill, in Europe, we have something that is a little easier to grasp. And that's in part because, we have to be honest with ourselves, anti-Semitism began in Europe. It's where it reached its most violent ends, yes, but it's also the site from which anti-Semitism spread, roughly from the 3rd century onward through European expansion, be it the Crusades or the colonial era. And what we have in Europe is a shared, almost 2 millennia history of anti-Semitism. And that's what's brought us to the moment that we have today. If you just look at, let's look at the decade between 2009 and 2019. If you just look at police statistics, you'll find that across Europe, with the exception of 4 countries, Belgium, France, Hungary, and Poland, although in the Hungarian and Polish cases, you can't really make the claim, this claim, because they changed the way they report hate crimes. But with the exception of those 4 countries, anti-Semitism increased over the course of that decade. Now, sometimes the upward swing was modest, like in Germany, it was 11%. Sweden was 11%, Germany was 20%. But in other countries, the upward trajectory was frightening. In Greece, it increased by about 100%. In Austria, 150%. And in Denmark, just between 2016 and 2019, a 292% increase in anti-Semitism. And why is this? Well, I'm not going to give you a physical location where anti-Semitism is most acute in Europe, because it's acute in different regions at different times for different reasons. But what is important to remember that across Europe, we have found that anti-Semitism is not particular to any one religion, any one culture, or any one country. We also see it across the political spectrum on the right and the left. We see it in healthy democracies and in weakening states, as well as in, we'll call them gently, emerging authoritarian regimes. And it has a lot of influences that we need to remember. These include, but are not limited to, religious bias, white nationalism, neo-Nazism, fascism, communism, populism, anti-Zionism, anti-globalism, extreme forms of Islamist ideology, which is different from Islam as a religious faith, post-colonialism, anti-Americanism at times, and conspiracy thinking. So it's a very, very complex issue. So you can't lay blame anywhere. It's a shared problem. And in an increasingly global world, it's a shared problem that crosses international boundaries. The ties between extremist groups, particularly on the extreme right, but also the extreme left, cross the Atlantic. We have American neo-Nazis being trained in Ukraine and parts of Russia. And we have kids, a 14-year-old kid from Estonia, creating a network of neo-Nazis that included Americans. This has become a global problem, and the only way we're going to solve it really is with a global response.
Thank you, Rob. If I may jump in here, so thank you for also differentiating, both of you, Sharon, Rob, to in Africa. There's so many different countries, of course, and it's the situation in South Africa is very much different from Yemen or from North Africa, in Tunisia or Morocco or Algeria. And in many of these countries, but also in Europe, Jews are tiny minorities. So we should not forget that they're tiny minorities. And what the Jewish communities face is only a fraction, I would say, from what the anti-Semitism really is. Because often the anti-Semites, or anti-Semitism can be in a country without almost any Jew. So, but there's still anti-Semitism there. So Jewish communities often get targeted, but the ideas, anti-Semitic ideas that I think destroy democracy profoundly, they can spread far beyond that, and they do spread far beyond that. So this is why I think this is really not only a problem for Jewish communities, but it's a wider problem in all of these countries. And only now a few politicians are beginning to realize that, so that there is some help to Jewish communities, but there is also at least an attempt to, first of all, to recognize this. But there are a lot of challenges going with that. First is when Rob referred to the numbers of incidents or hate crimes, anti-Semitic hate crimes. Most of these countries are only beginning to really have a good record in collecting this data. So that's a big challenge, collecting this data, because this policemen and women needs to be trained and register when there is an anti-Semitic incident. So most of that we don't know. And then also many who are targeted, they do not want to go to the police. because they think this is not going anywhere. So we need to improve that. That's definitely one thing. And where this is coming from, I mean, that was mentioned already. I think these are there are ideological big trends, but the way I see it, if you are more situated, if you consider yourself more from the political right, well, you pick the arguments that make sense in the sphere of the political right. If you're more on the political left, you pick these arguments. You might go more into what seems to be legitimate, attacking Jews for something associated with Israel. If you are from the far right, you say, oh, we don't want any foreign customs and religious slaughter that the Muslims and the Jews do, that does not belong in this country. Or these kind of rhetoric, you just use them to justify your hatred against Jews. So that, I think, these ideologies that have gone more and more into mainstream are accepted, at least not the hardcore arguments, but the softcore arguments are accepted more and more in the mainstream. So it makes it easier for anti-Semites to act out their anti-Semitism, if you want. And so that's why we see an increase, I think, in the incidents and more attacks on Jewish communities. More and more Jewish communities in Europe, they seriously think of leaving Europe because often it's a problem for their children. That's what I think is the most, the strongest not only example, but that shows many Jewish communities that children in the schools are not safe, physically not safe even, or they're harassed from anti-Semitic harassment, and they don't have a good option to take them out of the public schools and private Jewish schools. There are not many, first of all, but even the Jewish schools in all European countries, Jewish schools are highly protected, have to be protected by police. So that's not something that most parents like to see the future of their children. So this is really a real problem for many Jewish communities across Europe. And then you have, of course, different nuances. So in some countries, like in Poland, you don't have strong Islamist movements. There are almost no Muslims living in there, and Islamists, which Rob pointed out, are different from Muslims, and only very small fraction of Muslims are Islamists. So this is not a big problem in Poland or in Hungary, but the extreme far right or the Christian right, they are a problem, and Jewish communities face anti-Semitism from these communities or parties. So it's a little bit different across Europe, but we get a picture. Yes, in general, there's an increase in these incidents. Jewish communities feel less and less safe, and in the public discourse, we see more and more of the softcore anti-Semitic views being voiced and not being criticized. And so the power of the anti-Semites seems to also have been diminished, or at least they're not as vocal as I think they should be. So often it's not the question how strong the anti-Semites are, but more the question how strong the anti-Semites are, how that plays out. And so, yeah, we see all these factors here.
Okay.
Sarah, if I could just add just one more distinction, I think Gunther touched on it, but just to make it even a starker distinction, what we're seeing, and I think all the data that both Robert and Gunther have referenced, shows that most acts of physical violence against Jews in Europe, and I would say now in the US as well, has come from extreme right. In Europe, you obviously have Islamists as well. But what we're seeing on the extreme left is really the attitudinal problems, both online and surveys that we do. Gunther, I see you shaking your head.
No,
yeah, I see that.
It depends on the country. But if you look at France, all the murders, all the anti-Semitic murders were done, as I said, by Muslims, by Islamists, every single one of them. And it's difficult to see in the statistics to know, because most of the anti-Semitic crimes, you don't know the perpetrators. So we actually don't know, right? And also, as I said, Islamists are a small minority, and they're less Islamist than probably neo-Nazis, but this is even not the case in Germany. So Islamists that are monitored by the secret services more in numbers than neo-Nazis, right? So we have to see actually, but in Germany, the neo-Nazi scene is very strong. So most violent attacks still come from the extreme right in Germany, but that's a little bit different in France. So, and also in Belgium and in the Netherlands. So we have to look country by country, I think, if we want to see where the perpetrators are actually coming from.
Well,
I agree.
The UK as well.
In the UK, that's what I was going to reference. In the UK, it's really a very different. So I agree that really you have to distinguish from country to country, and it's hard to generalize. But the distinction I was making is that when you look on the left, still, maybe thankfully, we're not seeing really extreme acts of violence and incidents coming from the left as of this moment. Now, again, this latest conflict in the Middle East, some of what we saw in London and other case cities crossed definitely the line, and whether you want to kind of label that as left or what I call pro-Palestinian extremism, that's a whole new category now that whether they're Islamist or not, we need to really understand that better.
If I could just jump in, I'm going to complicate this even more. I'm much more on Sharon's side of the little debate than on Gunter's. I think there's been a tendency, particularly over the course of the last decade, to impose an understanding of the events that are happening in Europe based on our understanding of what has taken place in France and in Belgium. And I think that's inherently dangerous because, yes, what has happened in Belgium and in France, the violent attacks that have taken place there are incredibly frightening, but they are largely confined to that, we'll call it Francophone world, with the exception of some events that have taken place in London and one in the Netherlands. But what we see in terms of other violent actions across Europe are coming from other quarters. And there is nevertheless a tendency by those more right-leaning regimes of, I don't want to identify any one country in particular, but certain Central European and Eastern European countries, to blame the rise of anti-Semitism solely on incoming migrant Muslim populations, when they do not have those populations living in their countries. I occasionally am on the US delegation to the OSCE. I go to a lot of these international conferences with policymakers, and invariably in one of these extreme right-leaning governments, somebody will get up and say, it's because of what's happening in the banlieue that we are at, our Jewish communities are in danger. Well, that's true if you're French, but it's not true if you are Hungarian or Polish or others. And it also provides, I hate to put it this way, but I'll just say it, it provides propaganda fodder for regimes that want to destabilize Europe. You see rhetoric like this emerging from the Russian Federation from time to time, leading to more confusion and fracture in the European Union, leading to a further decline in faith and democracy in the European Union. I think that's where the challenge is. So I really caution against an over-focus, if we're looking at it from a continental perspective, an over-focus on Islamist forms of terrorist violence.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. You're absolutely right. We see a politicization of this with anti-Semitism, and this is not good in eventually fighting anti-Semitism in any way. So we see this in many countries, including the United States, that this is misused politically, and that you only see the accusation of anti-Semitism against the political opponent and never look into your own camp. So this is an unfortunate development, which is absolutely not helpful. And we see, I think this is that's why I always say we have to name it for what it is and be exact in the numbers and look at the countries. So if we see anti-Semitism coming from the left in some other forms, maybe it's not, or it is not as violent as from the extreme right today, because as I said, these terrorist attacks that were there from the political left. So in Germany also, they put a bomb in a synagogue in Berlin, and that was an extreme radical left small organization. We don't have that anymore, and that's good, very good. But they have other forms in attacking Jewish communities, and so we should not diminish that. And as you rightly said, Sharon, I think when people come to a synagogue or to a Jewish-owned shop to protest against the Israeli policies, well, this is questionable. Why do they attack then the Jewish communities for this, right? And that's a strong sign that this is anti-Semitic, and that's what many feel. And the Islamists are a small minority. Often they come from minorities that are also discriminated against. And so there's a hesitation in naming that. And I think this hesitation is also not right. So we have to name them, but we have to be specific and not say all Muslims are this and that, but we have to name it. Otherwise, this is a danger that I see that was too long, I think, in Europe, in countries like France, but also in Germany, where we see not as much the Islamist attacks, but we see in mosques that are run by Islamist organizations like Milli Görüş, or even DİTİB, that is Turkey run, that there is anti-Semitic propaganda in these organizations. And so we have to look at that, name it, and deal with that as anybody else. And of course, the nationalist right, we have also to see when they are trying to glorify their past and not to close our eyes and look at the actions that they want to, their heroes, they want to glorify what they had done 60, 70, 80 years ago, or 100 years ago even, in terms of policies to ostracize Jewish communities, or much worse. So we just have to look at these things and not also play the political game there, and just blame those for the rise of anti-Semitism that are not our political allies. But even among our political allies, there are some concerning things.
Let's take this discussion and let's pull out or tease out a few of the pieces that have come up. So let's talk along kind of two access points. Let's talk about Christian anti-Semitism versus Muslim anti-Semitism. We've talked about areas where you see elements of this, but what are the differences between these two forms of anti-Semitism? And what are the similarities? Is there overlap? So that's one part of this. And then the second part of this is, what are the sources of right-wing versus left-wing anti-Semitism? And again, you started touching on, the longer historical and nationalist legacy in Europe, for example, the end of colonialism and the shift of all kinds of previously colonized peoples into Europe or into their own kind of nationalist milieu in Africa or Asia. So can each of you build upon that a bit for us?
All right, I'll go. So, I mean, my thesis really would be that obviously Christian anti-Semitism historically has been far more extreme than in the Muslim world. This really related to the kind of origins of Christianity as a Jewish sect, the competition with Jews, ultimately blaming Jews for the killing of their Lord. So historically, I think we see that, and we still see remnants of that in much of the Christian world. And I reference that kind of in Latin America. You still see the anti-Semitism coming out of Latin America is very much ingrained in that kind of Christian anti-Semitism. The Muslim world, and again, someone who was born in a Muslim majority country, I'm Iranian born, American, what really came about, the anti-Semitism out of the Muslim world came really with, well, historically it's always been there. I can tell you from generation to generation, my grandparents had always told me, and we experienced it, again, someone who was born there, what did it mean to have that discriminatory kind of demeaning experience as a minority, whether it came from Islam itself or from just general societal tendencies. But really with the establishment of the State of Israel and the Arab world being the main force to delegitimize this new experiment, I think that what we're experiencing today in Muslim anti-Semitism comes from this push by the Arab world to really use the narrative against Jews to delegitimize Israel. So I think the difference that we're seeing even in the around the world, not just in Europe or not just in the Middle East, is not only taking the attacks against Israel and the delegitimization of Israel into a global argument and making it a global issue, holding Jewish communities around the world responsible. And you have communities like in Turkey today who publicly would say that they feel protected. They feel that the government, as a religious minority, they feel that their rights are being preserved. And yet we know that every day they're being tested. Every day they're being questioned and challenged about their allegiance, whether to the State of Israel or the feeling for support for the State of Israel. So we call those captured communities, the same as Jews in Iran today. Those are captured communities. They have to go above and beyond to show their hatred, in fact, of Israel, their rejection of Israel, their agreement with the fact that Israel is an illegitimate political entity. And so those are the real examples of what Muslim anti-Semitism in those Muslim majority countries looks like for those Jewish communities. And then if you want to take it to the extreme, then you can take it wherever you want with Islamist acts of terrorism and Islamist attacks on Jewish communities and so on. So I think Zionism played a very important role in the development of Muslim anti-Semitism, but it was there before, obviously, and this is just the newest manifestation since 1948.
Well, if I may jump in here, so I agree that there's this clear distinction, but both Christianity and Islam, they have to deal with the fact that a lot of their, if you want, philosophy is based on Judaism, in fact. So in Christianity, you have what the Christians then say is the Old Testament, Torah, and then they have to deal with that they now think the new truth is Christianity, is the New Testament. So we have this supersessionism that has been there for centuries, and that was partly overcome 50 years ago in many Christian communities, but is apparently coming back in some forms now, this idea of supersessionism, and that Jews don't have, as a religious community, don't have any legitimacy anymore, because there's this new Christianity that is now the truth. So this is an ongoing thing within Christianity, and of course very powerful, this idea that this accusation, this false accusation that Jews were to blame to have killed Jesus. So who has the power to kill what they think is God? That must be the devil. So that's very strong in Christianity, but that has been over the past 50 years, mostly, or 60 years. A lot of Christian communities have worked on that, but it's very young that this is not a strong theme anymore. So we have this in many, if you have this in surveys, you think that Jews are to blame for the killing of Jesus. There are, in many countries, we have very high agreement rates on that question. So it's still there, this Christian anti-Semitism. In the case of Islam, there is a different theological foundation of that. Also, if you look on the stories that you find in the Quran, many are almost the same as in the Torah. But in Islam, this is the idea is this is exactly the word of God. So how do you explain that these are not the same stories, but very similar stories? If you say this is the truth now. So in the Quran, also Jews are accused of falsifying scripture. So there comes with another like rhetoric with that Jews are accused of treason, that they're liars, and they're discriminated against. And then the history of discrimination against Jews and Christians under Muslim rule. So, but this was not this modern anti-Semitism with all these conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories were brought in by the Islamists, by the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1930s, so before Israel was created. They have this idea that we now are in the kind of end game of the world where Jews, Christians, and Muslims are in a religious war, and Jews are attacking the Muslims with the help of the Christians, and the Muslims have to defend themselves. So that's an idea that most Islamists have. So in this sense, of course, this is a strong reference to Islam that they make, right? This Islamists. That is, most Muslims don't make this reference, but Islamists do. And then on top of that, you have this pan-Arabist that you referred to, that who have made it from the beginning, saying we want to unite all the Arab countries. So after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we want to unite all the Arab countries. And why is that not happening? This is because of Israel. So they blamed Israel for decades. And you can see that still in the Syrian propaganda, in the textbooks they use in school, this anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic propaganda that they have as an outcome from this pan-Arabist idea that have been indoctrinated in many countries like Iraq, like Syria. And so this all comes somehow together in what people think now of Jews and of Israel. And that's even still there if there's no Jewish community or almost no Jewish community in the country anymore.
Yeah, I'm going to just add a little bit to that and then try to get to the second part of the question, the left versus right distinction. You know,
Thank you.
how do what should I add? I think Sharon captured a lot and then Gunter added to it. But, you know, maybe if I can complicate this a little bit more. Whether it's Christian anti-Semitism or Muslim anti-Semitism, I think I say this as a child of the American South, we're all familiar with people who will point to a holy text to justify their particular biases. On a broader level, though, the cultural, political, and social drivers behind the anti-Semitism that we see in the Muslim world, I think we also need to remember that is a European export that was brought by and large to the Muslim world. And this includes things like the blood libel, which is very common in the Muslim world now, this notion that Jews are predisposed toward murder and will kill children for body parts or their blood. This is something that emerged in the medieval era in England around the story surrounding the beatification of St. William of Norwich in the 12th century. You know, it didn't appear in the Muslim world until the 19th century in Damascus, when some Capuchin, a Catholic order of monks, some Capuchin monks went missing. It was imported to the region. Similarly, the protocols of the Elders of Zion are a European export brought to the Muslim world. And even the foundations that Gunter just outlined that make up the Islamist movement today have their origins in a few areas. One, French intellectual thinking of the 20th century, forms of intellectual thinking that were predisposed toward nationalism and other forms of biased thinking. Nazi propaganda in the Arab world in the period of the 1940s had an influence on what we see today as well. And surprisingly, on the other end of the political spectrum, the influence of Marxist thinking on how to develop a new order in a largely agrarian or industrial society. All of these brought in their own anti-Semitic biases and are expressed in different ways in different parts of the Muslim world today. So it's a shared problem in that regard, but there are significant differences between each. And going back to Gunther's earlier advice, we need to be precise and specific when we attack these things. We need to attack them on their own merits. There's no silver bullet in this case. The left versus the right distinction has a somewhat similar dynamic at play. But at the end of the day, when we look at the question, what are the sources of left-wing or right-wing anti-Semitism? I think in a certain sense, what we're asking is which is a bigger threat? And Gunther mentioned this earlier. What we're looking at today is slightly different than what we had in the past. I'm going to give you a quick history of the 20th century. You know, the anti-Semitic movements of the 20th century went as follows. Largely, it came from the extreme right in the period of the 1920s and 1930s through organized, I'm underlining organized here, organized groups, be they the Nazis, the Italian fascists, the Romanian Iron Guard, and others. In the period of the 1960s and the 1970s, anti-Semitic and other forms of, we'll call them terroristic violence, came from left-wing groups like the Red Army Fraktion in Germany, but other left-wing groups largely inspired by policies of the Soviet Union, policies that I think actually began earlier than the 1960s, that have their origin in Stalinist anti-Semitism that emerged around 1948. Then things began to shift again. By the period of the 1990s, the early 2000s, we began to see the threat coming from, we'll call them Islamist circles, from extreme Muslim circles, largely centered around the conflicts in the Middle East. I think what we have today is a different form of threat. I think it's a right-wing threat by and large, but there's still a left-wing factor that we need to bear in mind. But we're not talking about the same extreme right that we were in the 1920s and 1930s. The extreme right anti-Semites today, by and large, don't operate within formal groups. This is because they operate online, or they have smaller collectives, or they're inspired by other terrorists, including terrorists who have little anti-Semitic impetus. The individual who shot up the Christchurch mosques influenced, to a certain extent, it seems, attacks on the synagogue in Poway, as well as the attack on the Walmart in El Paso. So, these are crossing lines of bias, but it's much more diffuse, which makes it much more difficult to tackle and to respond to. And it's for those reasons, for the reasons that we still have left-wing drivers and right-wing drivers, that we need to begin to approach things a little, well, with more open eyes. Let me give you a parallel example, and then I want to hear from my colleagues. Let's look at how we responded to terrorism in the United States. After September 11th, for very good reason, we took our intelligence apparatus and we swung its vision to threats coming from the Muslim world for very good reason. But in doing so, we lost some of the capacity to respond to the other right-wing threats that posed a danger to the American public. After September 11th, the Oklahoma City bombing was the largest terror incident in the United States. But we forgot about that. We focused on the one at the sake of all of the others. And if you look at statistics, I know I'm using an American example, it's just because I don't remember the statistics for Europe. If you look at the statistics for victims of terror assaults in the United States, the largest group are people killed by Muslim terrorists. That's largely because of September 11th. The second largest group of victims come from right-wing extremists, and then left-wing extremists account for another, I think it's 22, if I remember correctly, victims between 1994 and 2019. So we really have threats emerging from all corners. And to do that, again, to reference my good friend Gunther, we need to look at each of these on their own merits and respond to all of them, not just pick and choose.
Sarah, if I may just add also exactly, I completely concur. But just this week, we saw the flags of Hezbollah and a Polish far-right group side by side at a protest in front of the Israeli embassy in Warsaw. So that also tells us something. Yes, labels and naming things are important. I completely concur. We have to be exact. We have to be very descriptive, and we have to be nuanced. But to also understand that these left, right, or in the broad buckets of labels that we're using sometimes are not useful anymore. Essentially, no ideology has a monopoly on anti-Semitic attitudes, right? And today, as it was just pointed out by Robert, there is no one source, there is no one ideology that has a monopoly, and that in fact that there's an amalgamation and coming together of very divergent ideologies coming together, and not only showing anti-Israel and anti-Israeli criticism, but manifesting in anti-Semitic attitudes. So that's kind of new, and that's really where the worry comes. Is where what we would have thought as really diametrically opposed ideologies in the past who would be really negating one another are actually finding common cause. And that's the thing to be concerned about, actually.
Let's go to some of the questions that have been coming in. They're pretty interesting. The first one is, what do you all think accounts for the staying power of anti-Semitism? In other words, why does it not go away? Other isms, like I guess the implication, other isms come, wax and wane, but this seems fairly steady. Why?
If I may start, and I'm sure you all have some good other things to add. I think it's in Europe, and Rob has mentioned that, I think at least in different ways twice, there is a strong, long history, and I think Sharon, you alluded to it too, of anti-Semitism in Europe. It's very deep, it's very strong, it's in many aspects of culture. Doesn't mean that every European is an anti-Semite, of course not, but it's a readily available explanation, how to explain the world, how to explain the society around the world if you blame the Jews. That's readily available in many cultural references. So that makes it very easy for anti-Semites for people who maybe are not, like, how do you say this, full anti-Semites, but people who are susceptible to some of these ideas and who like to take some parts of it, and as I said in the beginning, pick it from the extreme right or from the populist right or from the left a bit, or with some Islamist references, and what makes sense in their world, and then blame Jews. So it's readily available. So that's one thing in the societies. And then you have it also, it fulfills some needs, I think. That's how you can explain it. To be able to explain the world in that way. And if you don't see that there is a benefit for yourself to not to explain the world in these ways, that you're responsible for your own actions, that individuals are responsible for their own actions, and they don't blame some faraway elite that you don't know how to name, and it comes down to the Jews then afterwards, this conspiracy way of thinking, then it's very easy to go into the truth, because it's all available around you. It's available there, and you can just pick it, take it. And there are not strong enough voices anymore that say, well, no, our democracy really lives from, we have to take responsibility, we have to build alliances, we have to say what our interests are, we have to build communities together. So if you blame everything on some higher structure or something, then it's very easy to go into this room and attacking the Jew that you see on the street that you identify as Jewish. So we see, of course, the attacks against Jews in Europe, mostly those get attacked that are visibly Jewish on the streets. Right? So if you're young, if you're visibly Jewish in your what you wear, and if you're male also, then you have a higher, it's more likely that you get attacked on the streets. There have been some surveys done. So it's all to say, yes, this is all available. And that's why it's so hard to combat it. And the only way, really, I think, to combat it is to say, okay, we need to stress how important democracy is also for the people themselves, and not to show them the benefit of not going into this anti-Semitic way of thinking. And if we don't recognize the ideology of that, so if we only see anti-Semitism as a discrimination against Jews, we never recognize the ideology behind that. So we often don't see it. I was in a discussion yesterday, or 2 days ago, on another virtual conference. It was very hard for one professor to recognize anti-Semitism when it was not a form of discrimination. And this is what we see today with a lot, what I think is really can have a very good movement with this anti-racist movements. But if you see all the discriminations only as a result of some kind of power structure, then you don't see, and you belittle anti-Semitism with that, because it doesn't fall into these categories. Then Jews are white, and Jews are the perpetrators and the oppressors. So you have to see the ideology behind that, and that makes the left in a way dangerous in a complete different way than the right. It's a just completely different threat, but it can go together. And of course, Jewish people, wherever they are, if they're on campus in Britain or in the United States, or if they want to form a new Jewish community in some small Bavarian city, they face these threats from different corners. And that's what makes it so difficult for them to react to that, to defend themselves.
If I could build up on Gunther's thesis that anti-Semitism serves a need, it serves a purpose, and I'll just bring you a very contemporary example. And you referenced Iran before. I mean, why would the Islamic Republic of Iran use Holocaust denial as a major tool of its narrative, right? So this regime that came about as part of a revolution, as a result of a revolution in 1979, and not only had to consolidate its power in Iran, but also wanted to really establish itself as the leader of the Muslim world. Why did it feel the need that serving its purposes by, participating in Holocaust denial at the highest level, using anti-Semitic? I mean, we at ADL call Iran the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism. So it is a political tool that serves the regime very effectively in positioning itself today around the world, and maybe in the Muslim world, as the leader of the Muslim world. So it's just a very perfect example. And I think to Gunther's point, that you have to look at the ideology behind it, you have to look at the political motivations behind it. And that's key to understand why has anti-Semitism survived through the decades and through the centuries. It has served a purpose. And the notion of othering, the notion of putting your economic, political, social anxieties on an external group that can easily be not only targeted and attacked, but nobody else will also defend. It's been a sad part of the history of anti-Semitism. And today, the manifestations are right there in front of us. And many ideologies, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn's ideology of the hijacking of the Labour Party based on some of the notions that Robert shared, anti-colonialism, anti-Western, anti-American, kind of a Marxist ideology. Even that in itself comes from classic anti-Semitic roots from Soviet ideology. So it is really understanding the ideology behind it and knowing that that serves a purpose. It is a tool that is useful, that is effective, and sadly continues to deliver in ways that is pretty destructive.
What you're essentially saying is that the Jew writ large is the perfect target, because the Jew is an empty vessel into which you pour the meaning that you want to create. I mean, and it's fairly horrifying, because then I guess, and this will lead into our final set of questions for the evening, which is how do you disrupt this? How do you break this pattern? And it clearly is a pattern, whether it's a colonialist pattern, that runs through, the blood libel of the 1840s, and then into let's pop forward into the 20th century, and Hamas mentioning the Rothschilds in their covenant. So it's the left, it's the right, it's the Islamicists. Each of them is picking and choosing bits and pieces, and it's not clear to me that their ideology stops them from reaching across the political or even sometimes religious aisle to pull things in that are useful to them. And in our final session that's coming up next month, we'll be talking about larger and concerted efforts to stop this. But could each of you give us one area or one strategy or one tactic that you think could be used to start to disrupt this kind of behavior? And I guess, Robert, because you haven't gone on this section, so let's do. I'm going to do them the way you show up in the Brady Bunch in my screen. So we're going to do Robert, and then we'll do Sharon, and then we will do Gunther. Okay, so Robert, you're on. Rob.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we need to make a couple of arguments known to the wider public, and in particular to our policymakers and elected officials. And that argument is, A, there is a link between decline in faith in democracies and the rise of anti-Semitism. We also need to point out to them ways to identify anti-Semitism. This is something that needs to be pointed out to the wider public as well. Now, fortunately, there are good resources for this. I'm going to just mention 3 that you can look up on your own. Earlier this year, in 2021, the European Union published a handbook on understanding the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which is a useful educational tool to identify many of the forms of anti-Semitism we discussed today. Since 2017, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has published one series after another of excellent resources for not only identifying anti-Semitism, but responding to it, whether it's through security of Jewish community sites or through educational initiatives. I really recommend you look at those. And finally, earlier this year, the German government and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance published a series of tools to identify forms of Holocaust distortion and Holocaust denial, something that's important to understand because Holocaust distortion in particular, but certainly denial as well, act as a gateway drug to more pernicious and dangerous forms of anti-Semitism. So it allows you to cut things off before they can spread. However, at the end of the day, and I think both Sharon and Gunther have suggested this in their comments as well, we need to point out the absurdity of anti-Semitism. And one way that we can do that is by pointing to some of the more absurd conspiracy theories that we're facing today. Due to the decline in democracy, I think, or faith in democracies that we're seeing on a global scale, we see, yes, the rise of anti-Semitism, but we also see a rise in certain conspiracy theories that are extremely dangerous. And let's just take COVID very quickly. Since the pandemic began, I've identified at least 8 anti-Semitic conspiracy myths tied to the pandemic. These include claims that Jews created the virus, that they're responsible for its spread, that they profit from COVID-19, that they enjoy the deaths of non-Jews, that the pandemic disproves the Holocaust. There are religious leaders claiming the pandemic is God's punishment on Jews. We've seen, since we fortunately have vaccines today, people saying that Jews are using vaccines to exert global control. And then finally, the 8th form are people using images from the Holocaust to oppose national pandemic response. Well, this is strange and this is terrible, but we need to make it known that anti-Semitism, because it is that eternal scapegoat, anti-Semitism has crept its way in there. It's crept its way into other dangerous conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement theory. And it is, I know we don't have time for me to go into this in great detail, but it is now inextricable from the most threatening conspiracy myth of the moment, that being QAnon. QAnon is, for all intents and purposes at this point, an anti-Semitic conspiracy that claims that pernicious forces are kidnapping and killing children, something that has ties to the blood libel, in order to exert global control, something that has ties to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and even the cabal in charge of the great conspiracy for many of these QAnon believers consists variously of the Rothschilds, George Soros, and non-Jews as well, who they claim are in the thrall of Soros and the Rothschilds. So, this is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory at this point, and we need to point that out. And if we begin to make the broader public and our policymakers aware of the absurdity of anti-Semitism, we may have some hope of returning, pardon the analogy, returning the anti-Semitic trolls to their cave. We have allowed them out and they're running free. We will never get rid of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, but we can return it to something that is marginal in our society. And I hope we can achieve that at some point.
Before you and Sharon speak, one of our audience members, Rob, asked if you had given three sources of information. One was the EU Understanding IRA definition. The second was the OSCE. It was the third one where you talked about tools to identify Holocaust distortion and denial. And they were asking if you could say again what specifically or where it's located.
Sure, I'm caffeinated in the evening, so I'm speaking quickly. The third is a resource that was published by the Global Task, by the German government. I won't give you the full name. And the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance on recognizing and responding to Holocaust distortion. And the reason that's so important is we have found that the conspiracy theories of Holocaust distortion often are an entry point to types of anti-Semitism.
What you called a gateway drug.
A gateway drug, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Sharon was next.
So what we have done at ADL is really make a couple of big bets. And one is short, medium, long term, and the other is short, medium, long term. I mean, both really kind of look at where we are today in our society and what do we have to do this moment and what plans we have to see it in order to kind of continue the long-term effort to combat anti-Semitism. Obviously, education has been a big part of ADL in our 8-year history. More than ever, our surveys show that really ignorance about the Jewish people, about the Jewish experience, about our narrative, about our customs, traditions, culture, all of that is a huge factor. So what I can tell you is that we've just rolled out our first fully digital module on anti-Semitism for high school students, non-Jewish high school students. It is modular in that it tells first and foremost the story of the Jewish identity, talks about cultures and history and traditions. The second one is the story of the Jewish immigration. How did Jews come to America? How Jews came to the UK or Argentina for that matter. And the third one is really showing modern, contemporary, today manifestations of anti-Semitism in their lives. And the way we're doing that is in collaboration. So my team will export that to Europe, and we're just going to hopefully be piloting that in the UK, is getting the Jewish community with the Board of Jewish Deputies or our partners on the ground to tell the story with us. So we are creating the skeletal framework of what these modules will look like, and the story, the narrative, and the examples will be provided by each of the Jewish communities of the countries that we hope to bring this to. So it will not only be acculturated, translated, but the examples will be very important. So we think that a major investment in educating broad parts of our society globally about Jewish identity is critical, and that's a big bet we're making. The second big bet our CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, made about 5 years ago when he took out the CEO helm, came to the helm of ADL, was on technology. And we were the first organization, civil rights and Jewish organization, to literally be on the ground in Silicon Valley. And we established our Center for Technology and Society, where we had already started working with all major platforms in looking at solutions to combating online hate. We know that that is really the front line of the battle against anti-Semitism, because as we've all said today, the issues, the challenges have always been there, will always be there. What is different today is the megaphone that social media presents, and the connectivity and the amplification of what we're seeing. So our big bet on our Center for Technology of Society has been two-front. One is working with the platforms. We've had an engineering lab with them. We've looked at AI. We've looked at machine learning. Where are the technology solutions to, on one hand, making and look, we brought all kinds of perspectives. We look at social harm. We look at protection of children. This latest conflict, the biggest thing that came out of this latest conflict between Israel and Hamas was TikTok. It was how 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old children for the first time were exposed to anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, demonizing, language, where as a parent, I'm a mother of 3. Until before TikTok, I had full control over what my 9, 10, or 11-year-old would be exposed to. That's no longer the case. So the big bet really is working with the companies, the platforms, as much as they're willing to, and then also going on the aggressive stance and really bullying and pushing them to make the changes. And we did that through our Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which we did in 2019, where we brought over 1,000 of the largest private brands and companies around the world to take a month ad pause, not purchasing ads from Facebook, to really hit the bottom line and to deliver the message that it is up to Facebook to come up with its own solutions. It is up to them to make the decision that Holocaust denial, that the kind of hate and rhetoric and incitement that lives on their platforms should not be there. And look, the last point on that is that we look at these private companies just like we do at the automobile industry, the pharmaceutical industry. So you need to have a seatbelt, you need to have those caps that children can get into, and you have to think about consumer safety. Those companies also have to look at their products and the safety of their users. So these are the big bets we've made, and we'll continue to lean into those.
Okay. Gunther.
May I? Thank you.
May, but
Short.
do it concisely.
Good. 3 sentences or 4. Sharon, thank you for mentioning social media. We haven't talked about this, as we haven't talked about many other issues, but social media, of course, this is the single most powerful disseminator of anti-Semitic propaganda, of course, right? This is so massive. And the social media companies, they can and should do much more. And even the companies like Twitter, who have done some things over the past 3 years or so, taking down a number of accounts. But even among Twitter, what we saw in conversations about Jews, there was in 2019, about 7% of the conversations about Jews on Twitter were anti-Semitic, and there was an increase to 2020, in some of 2020, to 15% of the conversations about Jews that had the word Jews in there were anti-Semitic. So there was an increase even, although they said they have taken some of these accounts down, have taken this seriously, but it's maybe not enough, of course. So I think there are 2 main strategies. One is we have to take anti-Semitism seriously. It has to be condemned and called out, and not in Sunday speeches generally calling out anti-Semitism in general, because this everyone agrees with anyway, but then they voice anti-Semitism in a way that they think they can get away with. But we have to call out also the people by name and where anti-Semitism is coming from. Otherwise, we will not address it appropriately. So this is a challenge. We won't have always friends by doing so, right? But we need to do so, and we need to do it in a way that we do not blame entire communities and blame some people who vote for some political parties, maybe not the extreme right parties. I think that the blame is right there, but in many of we should stop blaming general people, but being specific in where we see anti-Semitic statements voiced, we have to name that and name also the politicians who do so. So that is an immediate task, not to let people get away with their anti-Semitic statements from wherever they come from, doesn't matter. So that's the first thing that is not happening. The second thing is a long-term approach, and Sharon, you mentioned a lot of these good efforts that the ADL is doing, and I know the Holocaust Museum in Washington is also doing really great work. But education, of course, and I think education in a way that stresses the importance of democracy, because at the core of the modern anti-Semitism is this anti-modern ideology that wants to destroy the democracies where everyone has a place, including Jews. So this is very important to see, well, everyone has the power to change things, and there is no world government that is a conspiracy theory. We have to educate from early on people to understand that, and then of course they will be resistant to these kind of thinking that I said is readily available in European countries, even more than in the United States or Canada, but even in Canada and the United States, these cultural references are also still there. So I'll keep it there.
Thank you. So before I let you go, I just wanted our audience to know that we have on our website at dhhrm.org, Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum.org, our initials, an anti-Semitism toolkit. And in keeping with what you were talking about, Sharon, earlier, that people don't know about Jews and they don't necessarily know about Judaism, the Anti-Semitism Toolkit does not just provide the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition and examples of anti-Semitism and how to disrupt it, but it also has sections on who are the Jews, what is Jewish history, what is Jewish religion, how are these things connected and related. So I would strongly suggest that people take a look at that, and we will be sending out an email link to everybody who joined us today to that toolkit so they can look at that. I wanted to thank all three of you, so Dr. Nazarian, Dr. Williams, Dr. Yakeli, especially at 2 o'clock in the morning in Europe where you are right now, for joining us this evening. It was a wonderful and interesting and enlightening conversation. And I would like to invite all of this evening's participants, both the three of you and the participants in this conversation as viewers, to join us on August 5th for the 4th part of our Crucial Conversations on Anti-Semitism series. And the topic of that conversation will be combating anti-Semitism. So thank you all so very much for joining us. And I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you.